thank you all for coming back into the series of presentations that we're having. And so we will kick off, and I'd like to present Thomas Kral, who is a PhD researcher with us on the ESJ program. And Thomas is also an educational consultant and a teacher educator. And picking up on some of the things that you were mentioning earlier, Hilary, particularly about language and the importance of language, Thomas is going to pick up on this and is going to talk about stories of agency, disempowerment, and decolonisation with regard to English at a women's college in India. So we look forward to hearing your presentation and to your insights on this, Thomas. So please do go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Don, and thank you very much to all of the organizers and for the opportunity to present. I also joined at the fairly last minute, not quite as last minute as some have, but I appreciate the opportunity to share my ideas. I mean, I'm amazed how I've been so impressed with the presentations today, and they're difficult acts to follow, but I'll do my best. And my presentation actually resonates a lot with what the previous presenters have said, as well as Don has already said. So I'll start right away on my presentation about English in India from the perspective of students at a women's college. And I'll give you a little bit of background. I was based at this college for about 1 year, just over 1 year, and I'm a teacher by profession and a teacher trainer, specifically in international education for languages and for English especially. So I've built a career on that, and I've become interested in the coloniality of English in the last several years, and so that's what's taken me to my current research. So yeah, so there's a tension around English in India. Of course, we know that English has a colonial legacy in India, and that colonial legacy is still very much alive today, and it's really apparent still in the country. So there's a consensus among most scholars that English in India advantages a small elite, but disadvantages most students. And higher education in India is almost exclusively in English medium, but a lot of students don't necessarily speak English all that well. And people who are more recently qualifying for higher education, and as higher education has expanded, the fact that university and college education is in English medium is a major challenge. So the statement made by Mohanty kind of rings true, and increasingly true as more students enter higher education. But it's not entirely a consensus, because there is some pushback against this view, in that English actually has potential for something different. And some scholars say, for example, that the spread of English in India, in contemporary India, has indigenous agency and voice. So this is kind of a bit of a controversial view, and so there's a discord, there's a tension around what English is, so what role English plays. So how is it possible that it could have an indigenous agency and voice? Well, basically as a tool for decolonization, the fact that English is a language of power allows subaltern communities, the most marginalized communities in India, to kind of bypass the structural barriers like caste, class, and gender, which are entrenched in society, and it gives these communities a tool by which to bypass these entrenched and embedded kind of prejudices in society, to access the global economy, which is becoming, since the 90s, has become a major source of employment and economic well-being for many people, and for which English is said to be essential. So this is where the tension lies in kind of the current discussions about English in India. So is it a language for the elite only and a gatekeeping language, or is it a language of opportunity for the masses? So from my own perspective, the research context that I was in was an all-women's college in the south of India, in the state of Andhra Pradesh. I was there as a partner, as an accompanying partner to my partner, who's a teacher, who was a lecturer there, a guest lecturer, as part of an international exchange like the ones that we've been talking about today. It's important to understand the context of this college. It is a college in the non-metropolitan area. It's in a small city in the south of India, and the students there are decidedly not from the metropolitan elite, where English is often heard and used, but in this context, it is not. English doesn't play much of a role in everyday society, apart from perhaps the very elite people who are not the ones who attend this college. So these are mostly students who are the first in their families to attend higher education, and who are the first in their families often to speak English or to engage much with English. The issue here is that many of the students at the college do not have very strong English. They have not had access to extra tuition classes and some of the higher kind of level teaching and access to English that others in the metropolitan kind of centers might have. So they're trying to, that's why I called the presentation Confronting English, because English really is a confrontation for many of them. And so I also see my own position here from as what Samia earlier told us about kind of power relationships, and I've done another presentation on my own positionality within this context as a white male researcher conducting research with female students in India. And so I don't want to spend too much time on this because I've spoken about it elsewhere, but I want to make it clear that I was very much kind of, it's been part of my whole ethos of conducting this study on my own kind of my reflexivity and my own positionality in this context. And I've tried my best not to kind of be the classic data extractor. So I didn't helicopter in and helicopter out to collect the data. I joined the community. I volunteered. I got to know a lot of people, and I didn't become an insider, but I became something between a total outsider and an insider within the community. So I kind of did my best to not make it an extractive experience. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to engage more with my research question, my overriding question, which was, how does English and English medium education empower and disempower the students? And for this, I used the capability approach as my kind of theoretical framing, and I'll talk about that in a moment. I just want to kind of combine the context and the participants a little bit with a couple of interesting visuals, which really sum up a lot of what the participants themselves have experienced. And so the first one, as you can see here, it's a mock poster that you see that. It's based on a poster that often appears in Indian classrooms, kind of a poster where a good boy behaves or a good girl behaves in this way, and it's something from the 1960s or 70s, and it's meant to motivate good boys and girls to behave in certain ways. And a satire was made out of this poster and widely circulated on social media about what a bad girl does. So. A bad girl roams around at 9 p.m. She wears the wrong clothes. She goes to a disco, and notice the next one is she talks in English. So English is in some ways connected to what a bad girl does of a certain social class. And so I found that to be interesting. And so here's a quote from one of the participants, Samira. It's a pseudonym, of course. And so she told me, yeah, most of the Indian women will get afraid to speak English because they thought that we are not fluent, we are not suitable to speak English. As me, I thought that starting, that we are not suitable. So this is kind of the context. Yeah, Samira comes from a small village, and yeah, she, women of her age were taught that English is not for you. You're not the right social class here, not the right gender. So that's sort of a background to all of this, where some of the participants are coming from, and many students in colleges like the one I was involved with. And then we have something completely different. We have something it's called the Dalit goddess of English. So the Dalit community, they are the untouchables. They're the most marginalized group in India. And about 10 years ago, an activist from the Dalit community built a temple and carved a statue called the Dalit goddess of English. And he encouraged the Dalit community to go worship with the goddess of English. So, and not even with, not necessarily always only with the Dalit community, but with others, other marginalized or kind of, poor segments of the population. English represents this sort of hope. So I've got a quote here, which all of my little things are covering up. So yeah, so one of my participants, and I can't see her name because Donica, yep. So in the past, poor people are not allowed to talk in English, but at present, English is a common language for all of us. In these days, we are seeing so many farmers who are not educated, and they are saying that my children should not be like me. They need to be well educated, and they need to get a good job. So they're keeping their children in English medium schools. So here we see, again, that the promise of English, the kind of the English as a panacea to social mobility, to socioeconomic mobility is real. And this was repeated to me again and again by the participants. Okay, so kind of getting onto my theoretical framework. So mostly from my kind of career as an education, as an educator and as a teacher trainer. So I've really observed in working with ministries and others that the human capital approach to education is the default, really. So in this approach, you've got your resources, which in this case is English medium education at the college level. You've got this as a route to socioeconomic mobility. That brings well-being, which comes in the form of professional employment. It's a very simple model based on kind of national economic growth and economic well-being for the students involved. Now, when I started talking to people, this didn't really capture adequately the situation on the ground, and so I chose the capability approach as an alternative. And the capability approach provides a somewhat different alternative. So here we see a more complex picture. We've got resources in the form of English medium education, and we've got well-being and capability. So the capabilities, of course, are what students are able to be and to do. So it's not really just resources and that lead to a good job, or English medium education that leads to a good job. It's English medium education. What are the students actually able to do with that resource? What sort of capabilities do they gain, and what do they do with those capabilities? And their well-being is then the capabilities that they choose as part of their capability set to turn into functionings, and then to live a life that they have reason to value and capabilitarian speak. So that's the first difference in the model, that the capability approach mediates the difference between resources and well-being through capabilities. But it gets a little bit more complicated than that, because we also have something called conversion factors. So because there are plenty of students who have an English medium education, but they don't build sufficient capabilities. Oftentimes they don't have the language skills themselves, or they don't have the confidence, or there are many other reasons they may not be able to develop their capabilities. And those in the capability approach are called conversion factors, and they might be personal, social, and environmental, and they either enable or constrain students from developing those capabilities. So that's a filter. Now, kind of what are some other factors here? So looking looking at the social conversion factors, looking at agency as a enabler from the student's perspective, and structural constraints as a constraint from a societal perspective. I was interested in, okay, sorry, let me just back up a little bit. Okay, so from the, I'll get to the, let me just turn that off. Okay, so basically the capabilities that students identified in the research as being the most relevant were aspiration, autonomy, and voice. And I've singled those out. There were many others, but I've singled out those three. And they kind of operate together, they depend on one another. And so, of course, many of the aspirations were to get a job as per the human capital approach. But others were a little bit different. So there was one student who wanted to learn about gender-based violence in English and make a change in her own community about that issue, for example. There was a student who wanted to create graphic novels, having read them herself, and have a larger audience for them because she wasn't able to do that in the regional language. In terms of autonomy, there was almost all of the students who were especially if they were going to go into postgraduate education, they were motivated by delaying or escaping forced marriage. Many wanted to study abroad, the first in their families to do so. They wanted to have their kind of underlying motivation wasn't just to get a job, but to have the autonomy to live a life that they value, not that their parents value. So so English there becomes kind of a language of resistance to patriarchal structures of forced marriage. So there's quite a lot more to it than just kind of going out and getting a job. There's more. It's a far richer picture that we see here. Voice was also came up frequently, the confidence to speak out against something like forced marriage or gender-based violence, and to be heard around the world, to have English as the global language, to access dialogues within India itself and more widely around the world. So yeah, a lot came out of the capabilities beyond just kind of the instrumental going out and getting a job. So looking now at some of the constraints, what are some structural constraints that kind of prohibit students from forming those capabilities? So I came up with three main ones from the data. And the first one was English as elite and elitist. So English as an elite language elevates it and elevates a native speaker standard or an Indian elite speaking kind of standard. And so this causes fear and anxiety, which is the second one, for students to speak out. They do not want to be seen as being poorly educated or being seen as inept because they don't speak English quite right. On the other hand, English is seen as elitist. So some students who do want to speak English and practice, they have been accused of showing off their language skills. And so they've been accused of being show-offs with their English. Excuse me. So there is that dilemma there. Either when they speak English, they get potentially scrutinized and criticized, and when they speak English and they speak it incorrectly according to the accepted standards, they're also criticized. So they face a lot of scrutiny. And then, of course, there's the patriarchal gaze. I liked that phrase, and that comes from, of course, the family unit often, and the neighborhood, the greater kind of society, where students' families are told by the neighbors, well, when is she getting married? There's no need to educate her. She's going to get married and raise a family, that kind of thing. So these are these structural constraints which are kind of holding students back from developing those capabilities that they value. As far as, so this leads to kind of agency and developing agency. And so in this case, what can, in practice, what can educators, policymakers do? What sort of reforms would be warranted as a result of all of this? What can be done on the ground and in the classrooms and in the lecture halls? And here, so what came out of the discussions was interactive pedagogy. Really was widely praised as a preferable alternative to kind of the banking methodology that the students most often get. They have high stakes exam for which they have to memorize, and they call it by-hearting. By-hearting, as in rote learning for exams, is basically an ingrained practice within the system. Students almost never have a chance to contribute ideas. They are really missing the opportunity to interact with and have a safe space to practice their English and to practice their even expressing themselves and to sharing their thoughts and ideas. They are spoken at, not included in discussions about the topics at hand. So it's a kind of a missed opportunity to develop agency when they don't have a chance to interact, and it's something that they really want to do. The other issue is what is needed is a language supportive ethos. The students don't feel supported in developing their language skills and their wider capabilities. This is something that Hillary mentioned in the last presentation. With scaffolding and languages, building a scaffolding for lectures to help students with their understanding key concepts, which doesn't happen too much. They might switch to the regional language, but not everybody speaks the regional language, so it's a multilingual campus. So basically, within a bottom-up interactive, kind of student-centered learning approach, it could include translanguaging, which is kind of a fancy word for using all linguistic resources to negotiate and navigate meaning between interlocutors. So that would be a really kind of valuable practice to embed, which would empower the students to speak languages that they know, combine it with English, not worry about the language, but worry about communicating effectively. At the moment, there is a strong push for the students to use English only, for the lectures to use English only, so that sort of system is not in place, and it's discouraged, and speaking any other languages on campus is seen as illicit or not really welcome, but it's done sort of on the side, whispered, and it's so rather than having it as a subtractive thing, it should be an active, proactive, additive thing of the more languages used, the better to negotiate meaning. And the last one is raising critical awareness about English itself. And this is where the decolonising part really comes in. So decolonising English, making English something that the students' own way of speaking is not isn't reprimanded. The standards that they are asked to maintain don't need to be native speaking standards or the standards of the metropolitan elite, but the way that success is measured should be by effective communication rather than elite correct or incorrect language standards, which may not mean much to local communication. So sort of reevaluating English locally, taking ownership of English as a kind of a part of a multilingual, translingual set of communication tools. So, and raising this kind of awareness.
Just to say that you have a minute left.
Okay, I'll be fast. So I'm just coming to the end, which is perfect. So just something to back up. I'd like to finish with kind of a couple of quotes and then a quote from one of the participants. So yeah, basically just to sum up what I was saying. So local communities basically bring their own values, discourses, and interests into the English language. So they basically co-opt English for their own purposes. And basically, in opening up spaces for the democratization of English, which is what we're talking about, and allowing greater equity for Englishes other than the metropolitan standards, decolonizing the mind of both the colonizer and the colonized is crucial. So involving the students, the teachers on the ground in those discussions about the power structures and dynamics of English, and not only have it at elite metropolitan universities as kind of decolonizing course, which they do have, but bring that to the level of the higher education institutions in the periphery. And the students are interested in this because when I asked these sorts of questions, they really did respond positively. So I'll finish with a quote from one of the students I spoke to. She told me after the interview that actually I enjoyed this interview personally because I have faced a lot of problems and a lot of advantages and disadvantages using this language. So it's not that some people are the haves and the have-nots, but they come in, even the same person has benefits from the language and has costs involved with it. So, and she said, I love to speak about this. So integrating this kind of discussion into the curriculum is up to other researchers to figure out how to do it, but that's what I want to end with. So thank you very, very much for listening. And I'm not sure if there's going to be any time for questions, probably not, but thank you for I'll be happy to answer on the chat.
Okay, thanks ever so much, Thomas, for a really interesting talk, which I think draws out a lot of the issues, if you like, with regard to language, but I thought very, very usefully bringing out both, you know, the disadvantages and the advantages within this context, because I sometimes think that actually the advantages aren't brought out to the same extent and aren't seen to the same extent, although they are there, I think. So that's really, really good to know. And also I was very interested in the ways that your findings were working towards concepts of well-being, which actually align very much with some of the original work that Deci and Ryan did on looking at components of well-being, and how what you've drawn out from this in terms of language there, which is, I think, more specific than Deci and Ryan were looking at, but nevertheless it aligns, I think, very, very well with that. So yeah, that I found a very, very interesting point, but a really, really interesting talk overall. So thanks ever so much for that.